and welcome to the Customer Conversations podcast. Today I'm excited to be joined by Chip Koziara. Chip leads the deal desk team at Uber, and is responsible for Uber Eats restaurant partnership strategy and pricing in the US and Canada. Chip, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on. Super excited to catch up with you today.
Of course, yeah, it's going to be a great conversation. I think we're going to get into lots of interesting stuff around customer data and like how you use that to inform the strategy and the things that you're doing at Uber. So maybe we can start out for those who don't know. What does it mean to lead the deal desk team at Uber, and sort of what does that actually entail?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when I first applied to that team, at Uber, I also didn't have a lot of familiarity with what that term meant. And for quick background, I joined Uber in a marketing operations role focused on building different tools to help our marketing team scale. And I was focused on the consumer side. And for those of you who don't follow Eats super closely, we have a three-sided marketplace. So we're focused on connecting eaters to restaurants and having the food from these restaurants delivered from couriers. So we have these three different types of customers that different parts of our businesses and different teams touch. And so I was focused on, the consumer side, or what we call eaters initially. And then about a year into my role, I had the opportunity to apply to, and then ultimately join the deal desk team. And I thought the name sounded kind of funny and was like, hey, what's this? But it's really all about focusing on merchant pricing. So making sure that we're making deals and setting deal terms with specific partners in a way that makes sense for both of our businesses. And so, anytime we entered, it started off more, with partnerships with, large enterprise restaurants, but the team scope now includes all restaurant partners in the US. And we work, across, a bunch of different teams to make that all happen.
Well, yeah, I'm sure in current times, recording this in May 2020, we'll see how that ages, but still
Yes.
particularly relevant with companies trying to go to a takeaway or order for pickup model. So I'm sure that's impacting the things that you're doing. But I think there's a really nice sort of segue here into I think what will be the meat of this conversation, which is sort of how do you use data to make those decisions, right? Your goal is to make decisions that work in the interest of both your business and your customers. Where does customer data, and I know Uber, or when you're at Uber, where you have a ton of data, so how do you go from we have all this data to it's actually helpful in informing our strategy?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll kind of start by defining what types of strategic questions we think about, and then backing into how we use data to solve those things. And I think a lot of this applies to platform businesses more broadly. So what I'm really focused on is what I call selection strategy. And so I think of selection, which is a common word, but applying it in this way, I think of it as the availability of distinct goods, services, or service providers that a business offers to its customers. So with Netflix, you'd think of their selection as the different movies, TV shows, and documentaries they make available to their customers. In a platform business like Uber Eats, it's the restaurants that we provide to our customers. And then, someone like an Amazon, it'd be, the different goods and things that they make available to their customers. So really focused on solving that selection strategy problem. And so kind of working backward from there, you have to kind of think through, what do our customers want? And that's really where a lot of this comes into play in terms of thinking about, how do we use, data to inform a lot of those questions. So do you want me to jump into a couple of different ways I think about that, or?
Yeah, I think that would be great if you sort of have sort of follow the data, I guess, is maybe a good way to think about it, sort of all the way from, how do you collect it to how does it actually impact that strategy?
Definitely. So a lot of it is, depending on what type of selection problems you're trying to solve, a lot of it might be, if you're in an industry where your selection is pretty straightforward. So if you are a florist and you need to provide flowers, pretty clear, there's only so many different types of flowers in the world. I don't know how many there are, but there's, some way to quantify that. And so you'd have that kind of available to you. And you could then kind of figure out based on different demand patterns, maybe buying data sets on what flowers are most popular, kind of back into what selection, could look like for your flower shop. Another way to approach it, so that's kind of going through the external data source or, sources. Another way to approach that continuing the florist metaphor, if the florist has a website and there's a search bar on the website and someone types in, I want 24 roses, the florist, would then have that search string of what someone actually wanted. And so you're getting kind of like a revealed preference almost, where it's like someone's typing in a freeform text box, like, actually, this is what I want. And so you're getting a data point that's, not really a survey because there wasn't a menu of options available. It's someone who's presumably, at or close to the point of purchase. So they're giving you data that's, pretty interesting. And then, you'd have to do a lot of things on the back end to make that data usable and more structured. But that's another super interesting way to go about it. And then you can look at what your competitors are doing. So you could look at the flower shop down the street or across town and see what they're making available to you. So I think those are a few different ways that that problem can be approached. I think one of the things that doesn't fully solve is if you're kind of in a new space where people might not know what options are available. And so if you're on Netflix and you're looking for, like, I don't think anyone knew like Stranger Things. Like, I don't think anyone was like, I'm looking for like a retro 80s, like, horror TV show that's, based on a bunch of kids' lives. Like, that wasn't something people were searching for. Presumably, maybe they were. So I think, it's not a perfect solve for like, this is everything you'd ever need. But I think it's a really, really good start.
Right. Yeah, that totally makes sense. So, and I guess there are some other ways to get sort of, once you have customers who you're able to have a conversation with, or able
Totally.
to, either your reviews, or, and you mentioned competitor data as well, like reviews of competitors, sort of feature requests is maybe not the right word in the florist example, but, I got this, but I would have liked X, or like, can I also get Y, right? You start to be able to, identify those additional data sources. So, you mentioned that like on the back end, you have to go through sort of a cleaning process. So there's some work to be done to go from, there's all this data that exists that I have access to I can actually use that to inform my business. Can you sort of speak to that a little bit? I know we talked before this about sort of nerding out about some of the actual ways that we do that with text analysis, and sort of, I guess the bigger bigger question, I guess, is sort of quantitative versus qualitative, and sort of where, like, how the mix of those things comes together. But maybe we can speak to sort of and maybe continue to use the flowers example. I kind of like this example,
Yeah.
as it's such a non-tech example, but
Totally.
speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think using the florist again, so let's say the florist has access to their database and they're super excited to start writing some queries, like, or, looking at the tables, they can pull out kind of all those different searches and look at them. And again, you're gonna have 24 roses, hydrangeas. I don't actually know too much about flowers, so I'm gonna start to run out of daisies, run out of flower examples, but they'd have all those in an unstructured format. And I think I think depending on how big or small your data is, if it's your florist, like maybe you're only getting a dozen searches a week where, you can manually go through that and, throw it into a Google sheet and, make some sort of, ranking where maybe you're getting a third of your searches are roses and, two of them are daffodils, and then, kind of the longer tail of random, sorted flowers. So in that case, I think it'd be like, take a lighter approach, pull the data out, throw it into something like Sheets or Excel, and kind of crank on it that way. I think once things start to get later, so I think like earlier in a company's life cycle, probably like that kind of more manual approach is probably best, in kind of looking at things, every entry in every record. As a company starts to scale, you're going to not totally be able to do that. I think it's always helpful to look at a slice and, data, a certain day or something like that, and just kind of see what's all in here. But I think that's where kind of having, those like industry data sets, so using the flower, like the flower repository, these are all the different flowers that we can have,
Right.
and use that as your source of truth for like, possible SKUs or possible like available selection, and then mapping the, kind of search strings to that. And so a few different ways to do that. You can write a bunch of SQL case whens to, kind of make everything, fit in that. And if you only have 120 different types of flowers or SKUs, like that's actually probably a pretty good approach, is to just like keep that business logic in SQL and do it that way. If the kind of search space, I guess, of all those different SKUs is much broader or changes frequently, that's when I think, starting to do some more, text analysis and pulling in some like Python libraries or R libraries to start to crank a little bit more comes into handy.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to sort of think about, volume of data, right? And there's always, or usually at least, ways to get more data, right? Like if you talk about the search box and your individual small business website maybe isn't getting a whole lot of traffic, period,
Right.
whereas Google is getting a lot of traffic, right? And you can do
Yes.
local search on Google or whatever you want to do. And I think it's interesting to sort of identify the specific things that you're looking for, right? You're really looking for the exact terms that the customer uses to, which helps on a couple of fronts, right? A, it helps you determine this is the thing that they're looking for. I need to make sure that I have that in my selection, assuming that there's enough people, who are searching for that. But it also sort of gives you some context around that, right? Like, I guess less so in search queries because they tend to be pretty specific, right? But in things like reviews or in, and you may get this in support tickets, right? Or in like chat transcripts is like, why am I looking for this thing? Or like, where does this fit? Like, I'm looking for this thing. I think as you get this from search too, but like, I'm looking for this particular thing at 9 a.m. on a weekday only, right? And like, that's where your volume comes from. So I'm curious, sort of, how do you think about like mapping this sort of, once you really get into the data, you can totally get lost in the data, right? There's
Totally.
so many different things that you can pull out. Where do you sort of say like enough is enough? Like I have the right amount of data, I have enough signal to move forward and sort of go to the next step and actually start to use that data?
Yes. So definitely will answer that question, but I just thought of something as you were talking. So like, let's say in our example again, like someone's typing in Valentine's Day instead of typing, hydrangeas. So that's like interesting because their, job is I want something nice for Valentine's Day, not I want this very specific type of flower. And
Right.
so if you just had all the SKUs of possible flowers, you're going to miss that. And so I think that's why looking at, slices of data and like of the raw data and kind of like understanding how it fits together and like trying to back into like what people are thinking about and like what problems they're trying to solve, what their jobs are, then I think, you can have better mapping. And, just knowing that someone's looking for Valentine's Day isn't going to give you, that's not a SKU that you can just like throw up on the website.
Right.
But I think that's helpful for a question that you could use in a customer interview where it's like, hey, I noticed that you searched for Valentine's Day. Could you please tell me more? And so I think
Right.
that's kind of where that kind of can come into play too. But your question on one is enough, I think it depends on a lot of different things. I'm of the camp like 80-20 it, where like, let's figure out what's going to give us kind of the strongest signal as quickly as possible and then start to move on. We can optimize later. And so for me, like, I'm not a data scientist. So for me, it's just like, let's, kind of do the, the quick and dirty way to get to a great answer and then, optimize later. So at that point, it's hard to know. It's more of an art than a science, but really like once you feel that you have a pretty accurate understanding of what your customers want and um can kind of pull that together and synthesize that in a like digestible format. And so what I think that would look like is like a pivot table or something like that where you have like kind of like all the different like products or merchants or types of flowers or packages and can see how many people search for how many different ones in a way that's like meaningful. So if you can see that, over the last year, 832 people searched for roses, and 645 people searched for peonies, and 4 people searched for daffodils. Like maybe daffodils isn't something that needs to be a big focus, and you'd move on to the next phase, which is what I think of as like actually going out there and acquiring the selection. And so depending on the org you're in, the company you're in, if you're a solo founder, like you're going to be doing kind of like all of that work too. If you're in a bigger org, maybe it's something that sales or BD would take on. And so you essentially give them the kind of customer priorities and say, hey, these are the things that we need to bring on. So like for Netflix, like, maybe they saw everyone searching for Seinfeld and decided that that was, I bet Netflix definitely looked at those logs and saw like it's worth bidding for Seinfeld. And so, they were able to hand that to the sales team and say, or the finance team and say, like, this is justified because we had millions of people searching for a show that we don't offer. And so I think empowering other teams with data is kind of that next step, or if you're a solo founder, empowering yourself
Right.
with data to take that next step.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting to think about. The way that I sort of think about this is that uh, it's like a, it's, it's like an efficiency optimizer, right? Like it's
Yep.
the more data that you have, and the great, and this is why it's a scale, right? There's different levels. I really like the sort of 80/20 sort of stance that you can go all the way if you want. You can, well, there is no all the way until you really get it out in the world and test it. But you want to go sort of to the point where you feel confident that this is a better bet than something else that we could be spending the same time on, right? So I'm curious, sort of at Uber, and maybe you can give like an example here that sort of how do you present that case, right? Like it's sort of like I've done the research, I've done the digging through the data. Like I now have to give that to somebody else and sort of convince them that this is the right path, or that this is this is valid enough to sort of take on. How does that process look like? What does that sort of inner team communication, or even sort of within the team
Totally.
look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. So really just synthesizing the data and making a business case, and especially compared to the alternatives. So essentially like an opportunity cost. So let's say that, again, with the flower example, let's say that I am recommending to our master florist, like what they need to stock. I'd say the roses is being searched for like much more frequently, and you'd give the number than the daffodils. Therefore, like we need to either get more rose merchants, or we need to figure out a better way to stock it, and kind of showing what that data looks like. And I think it's not just the number of searches. I think you can take it a step further and think through, of searchers who are looking for roses, how many of them go on to convert on other items, and if they drop off, that's interesting. So maybe the peony example I gave, I think I said peonies earlier, where people only searching for, or whatever it was searching for like 4 of them. Maybe those users all drop off. And so, yes, it's only 4, but if conversion is effectively 0% for those types of searchers, that's also interesting. So I think painting that full picture of, there are customers that we are losing who want a very specific thing that we don't offer. And so, yes, there's a big business opportunity, to go after options A, B, or C, but they're not as big when you like kind of dig into the numbers, because those customers are going to buy something else if we don't. Whereas like customers who want option D, like they're gone, like they're going to go to a competitor, they're going to go do something else if we don't get them. So I think like painting those alternatives of, what the business impact is, and kind of what the effect on, your customers or potential customers would be is super, super important. And then I think like having, in terms of like, how it's communicated, I think it's really just like empowering the other teams to understand, what customers want, and to be able to prioritize, their book of business accordingly. I think we can talk a lot about sales incentives and things like that, which, there's some interesting things you can do there, but I think that's a bit of a rabbit hole.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of topics there which we could go on for hours about. I think one thing that sort of comes to mind as you're talking about sort of the follow-on impact of a decision, and why it's so important to sort of go beyond just scratching the surface in a lot of cases. We had Kristen LaFrance on in the second episode of this podcast, and that conversation was all about retention-based acquisition, which is sort of very related here, right? That
Totally.
the type of customer that you acquire up front has that you target and then subsequently acquire initially has a knock-on effect on, is that a customer who continues to purchase? Do they stay subscribed if you're a recurring subscription model? Do they go on to refer people, or are they just there for a one-time, one-off, like in and leave type experience, which might look good initially in the data, but potentially if their motivations on what is best for your business, or don't match what your business best provides, it's not necessarily a long-term win. Cool.
Totally agreed.
Yeah. So one thing that I'm really curious about, and I think is particularly relevant to ask you, because Uber Eats has so much data compared to a lot of businesses, both in SaaS and in other consumer businesses. But what's the right mix of quantitative versus qualitative data? Because I know a lot of people, when you talk about like user interviews, or like let's do 5 or 10 or even 20 user interviews in a given period. Well, that can't possibly be enough because we have hundreds of thousands or millions of users. So we have to go to quantitative data. Where do you think there's, and I'm certainly not advocating that everybody should be doing only user interviews, but where do you find is the right balance between sort of looking at what people are saying versus just the numbers of when they search or how frequently they select X?
Totally. That's a great question. So I think this one's tricky. The way that I think about this, which is based on my experience in early stage companies pre-Uber, and now being at, a big public company, I think the user interviews matter more, and I can unpack that a little bit more, pre-product market fit. So before you have product market fit, having those qualitative signals and understanding how a user perceives your product, I think are super valuable data points for informing product roadmap, business model, a lot of things that just require more feedback and hands-on experience. And I think the data that you're going to have prior to product market fit is probably going to be much noisier. And so you're going to probably be looking for signal and noise as opposed to really digging into what a specific customer's needs are and unpacking how your product or service is solving those things. So I think once your product market fit, I think talking with users is still very important, but I think it's more of a Bayesian bandit type thing where you're doing a sampling randomly to make sure that you're still on the right track, where the data is going to inform you toward optimization. I think you mentioned before efficiency, it's
Right.
going to help you become more efficient, but it's not necessarily going to point you. It's not a good compass. It's a good measuring device, but it's not a good compass in terms of showing you where you exactly need to go from a strategic direction perspective. I think it's more of an optimization tool.
Gotcha. Interesting. Yeah, and I think there's as with everything, it always depends, right? And
Yes.
that's the stage of company and sort of, and I guess also how much data you already have about your customer, how much you've been optimizing to date, sort of all plays in, right? I will say that's
Yes.
certainly one thing that is, once you're at some kind of scale where you have data readily available, whether it's you just have a lot of traffic to your website, so it's easy to survey a sample of those people, or you have customers who are leaving reviews, or you have lots of social media commentary or whatever it might be, it becomes much easier to do. You can almost do quantitative analysis of the qualitative data, right? It's just
Totally.
the methods change, right?
Yes.
Or at least more methods become available to you.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to add is I think a lot of bigger companies are launching new products, new services, things like
Mm-hmm.
that. I think that's where a lot of that, customer interview and customer feedback becomes important, even though the company is big. And so I think, it also depends contextually, where you are within a company. So Uber Eats, when Uber Eats launched, years ago, Uber was already a big, company at that point, and they launched this new thing. And so, how Uber Eats functioned back then is different than how it would function today, or Netflix
Right.
when they first started offering their streaming service versus their DVD service. Same type of a thing.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great point. That it's all contextual, and it's not a. I think sort of a big takeaway here is that it's not a one and done type process, right? These things are. I think as the data changes, as the market changes, sort of something to be constantly reevaluating, and new questions come up. You need new ways to answer those questions. Cool.
Exactly.
This has been really awesome. I know we could go on for hours and go really deep on any one of these things that we've talked about. But for somebody who is sort of just starting out and maybe hasn't sort of taken a data driven or a done a deep dive into their data or any available data before, what's sort of the first sort of the starting point that you would recommend to them, so they can there's a lot of noise out there. What would be the one place that you'd recommend they start?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think my POV is that people try to optimize too quickly. And so, people jump immediately to, let's pull out this shiny new machine learning library, which is super cool and super interesting. But I think for most people starting out, I think the best thing to do is to fire up SQL, run, pull a query off of a database and just get the raw data and look at the raw data. And then pump that into something like Excel or Google Sheets, and really just start there. And I think getting more complicated where, maybe the SQL report that you're running, you add some case whens to, start to clean the data and add a little bit more structure, or even hacking that in sheets where you're doing, different string matching or regular expressions to try to clean the data too. Like I think just starting with super simple tools to dig in and see what your users are searching for and what your users are trying to achieve, and starting there before trying to get too crazy. And I think once you do get to that point where you want to start to optimize, I think Python has a lot of different interesting libraries. R does too. I'm partial to R, but it's also pretty ugly language, and Python's probably a better choice for most folks.
Cool. Well, this has been great. Where should people go if they want to keep up with what you're working at Eats, or just sort of in generally? I know you write as well. Where should people go to keep up with you?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Excited to get that plug in too. So I am Chip Koziara on Twitter, and then also just chipkoziara.com. Those are the two best places to follow me. I also write a newsletter, which you can subscribe to on my website.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for doing this. This was awesome.
Thanks so much for having me on, Stuart. Really appreciate it.
The Customer Conversations podcast is brought to you by the team at LearnWhy. LearnWhy integrates with all of your customer-facing tools to organize feedback and extract actionable insights. Empower your team to start growing your bottom line today with insights from qualitative data powered by LearnWhy. You can find out more at either learnwhy.co or by emailing our team at sales@learnwhy.co. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Customer Conversations podcast. If you or someone you know has expertise in growth, marketing, or product, please have them reach out to either Sean or Stuart to learn more about becoming a guest on our show. Our team can be reached by email at support@learnwhy.co.